Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. DNS, an asset, not a liability, sponsored by Infoblox. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Matt Bromiley, SANS Digital Forensics and Incident Response Instructor, and a GIAC Advisory Board member, and Srikrupa Srivatsan, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Infoblox. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Matt.
Perfect. Thank you, Carol. And hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. If you recognize this is not my normal voice, you are 100% correct. I apologize. I woke up feeling hoarse like this, and I really do not know where it came from. I don't feel sick. I just happen to sound like this today. So regardless, we're still going to have an awesome presentation today. We've got a really, really good webcast lined up talking about DNS. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We're super excited to have you here with us. All right. So as Carol mentioned, today you're going to have the pleasure of hearing, well, I won't say pleasure hearing from myself. You're going to get to hear from me first, and then you're going to have the when she comes on to talk about Infoblox and some of the awesome things that they're doing with DNS. But I wanted to help set the stage for her first, and I wanted to talk to everyone a little bit about some of the issues that I'm seeing in the field when it comes to DNS, some of the problems that my clients are experiencing, and then also some of the ways that our teams can get a lot better when it comes to actually dealing with and incorporating DNS. So one of the first things I'd like to talk about today is DNS and your security posture. I'm really, truly hoping everyone watching here has DNS as a consideration in what they do, a consideration of part of their posture, and they're aware of it as an attack surface. If not, we're going to talk about why you should and how you should, obviously. Then I'm going to spend one slide on DNS basics. I know most folks watching understand how DNS works. I know you get it, but again, we want to make sure that the playing field is level, and that everyone understands exactly what we're talking about when we refer to the various attributes of DNS and how they can be useful and beneficial to your organization. Then we're going to talk about kind of a two-part topic of the same type of thing. We're going to look at some common DNS attacks that are taking place today. And then I've also got an example of a case study of DNS abuse that's currently happening in the wild right now. And when I say right now, I worked a case about 3 weeks ago that involved this particular piece of malware that we're going to examine. If you are working inside of the retail or the hospitality space, or you have POS devices in your network, you're definitely going to want to listen up when you get to the abuse in the wild. Because if you're in that space and you're not paying attention to DNS, you might get bit. Then we're going to focus on what I really consider to be the most important part of this, is making sure that I turn something that I'm going to spend a little bit of time describing as a liability, I'm going to turn it into an asset for your organization. And we're going to talk about how we can leverage it to our benefit. And then we're going to do a little brief look at what's next after we've examined ways to kind of turn DNS into something I can use instead of abuse, what's actually next on the horizon for it. So first and foremost, DNS and your security posture. Again, I'm talking about you securing your organization. If you're someone who's on the stakeholder or the decision maker team, please, please, please make sure that your subordinates and your folks are considering DNS and what they do. If you're one of the defenders on the organization who has to protect these various items, I really hope that if you're not going after DNS right now, you are telling your bosses, you are telling those signature writers, you're telling those stakeholders and program managers, hey, this is something we need to be looking at. DNS, quite frankly, is extremely crucial to the overall functionality of the internet. Folks, we don't get anywhere without DNS whatsoever. I'll tell you right now, gone are the days where we used to get phone books with phone numbers. These days, I'm sure a majority of people watching, if not everyone, has some form of a smartphone. Smartphones and phones in general have made it easier to say, I'm not calling someone's number, I'm calling mom, I'm calling dad, I'm calling my significant other. DNS works very much the same way. We're going to get into the basics in just a moment. But imagine if I took your smartphone away today, would you be able to call all of the numbers in there from memory? Definitely not. Would you be able to open up Yellow Pages and find all those numbers? Definitely not, because they're not listed in there. So DNS works very much the same way. You see really how crucial it is. You never watch the news, and the news refers to a news story about a company located at 8.8.8.8. They're referring to Google. They never refer to things like Facebook's IP address. They talk about Facebook. However, despite knowing just how prevalent it is, I find in my day-to-day that a lot of organizations still do not consider DNS in their security plans. And here's what I see a lot of. I see a lot of folks, they focus their spending and they focus their security products on securing HTTP or making sure everything their company does goes over port 443 and it's encrypted HTTPS. I see a lot of focus in that area. But the odd thing about it is in order for me to set up that encrypted communication, in order for me to set up that encrypted tunnel, I've got to have DNS underneath all of that. DNS is the one that allows me to go to a website and set up that communication by going by the website domain, by going by the website name instead of doing everything by IP address. But because a lot of organizations are told encrypt your traffic, make sure that your organization is running on 443, close port 80. Attackers like to do everything over port 80, close port 80. Make sure you monitor 443. A lot of security products will actually talk to you as well about SSL inspection. That's one of the newest, I don't know, newest is the wrong term, but it's definitely one of the, I would say, most sought after and recently implemented features that a lot of folks find in products is that SSL inspection, where again, they're doing a lot of focus on port 443 and trying to understand, but DNS is left over, it led by the wayside. But even worse than being excluded from your security posture, folks go this next step further and they just leave DNS wide open. Your network engineers and your product implementation folks, they know just how crucial DNS is. They know just how crucial port 53 is. So they just leave it wide open. A lot of attackers these days are banking on you making some of those critical mistakes. They are banking on your organization going down that exact thought process, which is, I'm going to do everything over 443. I'm going to lock down 80 really tight. I'm going to close everything above 1024 that my organization is not doing, but I'm going to leave 53 wide open to the public, or I'm going to leave 53 wide open for my organization to talk outbound. And therefore, there's no monitoring around it. No one's taking a look. The issue with excluding port 53 or excluding DNS from your security posture really lands on the types of attacks that DNS can lead to. And let me be frank here. If you've read about an extremely destructive attack in the past, I would say, year or so, if you've read about any of those really, really large hundreds of gigabits per second attacks that have happened, you're likely reading about a DNS attack, not a port 80 attack, not a port 443 attack. If anyone here watching is in Holland, or if anyone's been reading up on what's been happening lately, there's been, unfortunately, a lot of attacks against Dutch companies because of some recent threat intel reports that have come out with regards to various APT groups and geopolitics and whatnot. We're seeing very, very, very disruptive, potentially disruptive attacks coming out of DNS. And for that, because port 53 and because DNS poses something that could literally bring my business to a halt for a period of time, that is why we need to make sure we consider it part of our posture, because it can just be so dangerous. Now, the last little line that I've got there speaks really to a lot of product implementations and a lot of vendors that you will work with these days. A lot of these vendors, they come in and they will do a very good job about securing 99% or 95% of your organization, but they will leave DNS in your hands. And they will say, make sure you have an internal server set up, Make sure you have your DNS routes set up correctly, but a lot of folks will leave the DNS part for you to deal with. So if you've got the latest gizmos and gadgets inside of your network, and you've got an awesome SIM that pulls all these logs in from sources all over the place, I want you to do me a favor right after this webcast. Go and see how much DNS traffic you've got in there. See how long you're retaining it for. But more importantly as well, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, see what your team can actually do with that analysis as well. See what they can actually do with that data. Unfortunately, some of you may find you're not actually capturing DNS at all, and it's kind of sitting there unfettered. You may be getting the net flow traffic that shows port 53 activity, but you're missing a key piece of that. So again, we're going to dig into some very, very detailed explanations as to why it should be part of our security posture, but I just want to come out of the gate and say, folks, please, please, please make sure that you are considering DNS. And let's talk about why. Before we jump too deep, though, like I said, we're going to spend one slide on the basics. Now, I kind of already laid the groundwork for this particular slide. Just as a refresher, let's say you get on the internet and you want to go to google.com. Very few folks have the actual IP address that you would type in to get to Google's main server, to get to Google's main page. Now, I like to, usually when I teach a lot of incident response classes, I like to run through this exercise with my students. There's always, I find, 2 or 3 IP addresses that everyone usually has memorized. It's 127.0.0.1. Everyone knows localhost. Everyone knows how to go home. There's 8.8.8.8, and then there's also 8.8.4.4. Everyone seems to know those public-facing Google DNS. Now, some folks know the open DNS, or some folks know their home IP and whatnot, but population-wise, everyone seems to know the Google outward-facing DNS server that anyone can access. However, very few folks know other IP addresses that may be listed. No one, I don't see folks use the IP address to get to Facebook or to get to Google. So DNS is what helps you get there. DNS is what allows me to type in a address, a web address, an HTTP address, or a subdomain, whatever it may be, and that allows me to get to where I'm actually trying to go. DNS is the one under the hood. It's basically the phone book who's saying, oh, you want to call mom? Mom's number is this. Let me dial that for you. And it pulls all the pieces together. Now, in order to understand how DNS can be a part of your security posture, we have to talk about a couple of the steps that those DNS requests take. So I'm a user and I want to go to google.com, or in this example, I want to go to site.com. I type in site.com. There's a few different servers that request actually goes through. Now, if you've done a lot of work with DNS, you know that this graph is a very, very simplified version. But essentially what happens is it goes to one cache, likely my organization's local DNS cache, and it says, do you know where this address is? Do you have any idea? Do you know where I can go? And if it doesn't, it bumps up the line and it goes to your ISP. And if your ISP still doesn't know, then it keeps going up through the top level domains, goes through the DNS until finally, the various DNS servers, until finally it gets to the site that you're looking for. And then that IP address comes all the way back through the wire and your connection is made. That's in a nutshell what's happening with DNS and how it works. We need to be aware of those multiple steps, because remember, I'm talking about making DNS part of your security posture. But you'll notice here, there's a fundamental part of DNS lookups that is not your hardware. It's not part of your organization. How do I protect systems that I don't own, that I don't have access to? We're going to talk about that in a little bit when we get to converting DNS into an asset. But just remember that that DNS lookup likely traverses multiple external servers before it comes back to you, unless it's a site your organization frequents a lot. You may have it cached locally. So you may have the benefit of having it there. We'll talk about in just a second here how that can actually be used against you well. It may go up to your ISP, but ultimately it's going to go to the root and we're going to get back that IP address. So again, level set, everyone's aware now. We're talking about the flow that a DNS request has to go through in order to allow John Q user to get to site.com whenever he tries to access that particular page. Stay with me at this level. So remember I said that sometimes the IP address or the website that you're looking for may actually be cached in your organization, or it may actually be cached in your system. Maybe you went to facebook.com yesterday and the cache, the IP address resolution for that site is still saved in your system somewhere. Likely, if you're like me, you've probably already got 3 or 4 tabs with that site already open, and for some reason you open another one instead of closing tabs down. But we're not going to spend an hour talking about browser tabs because, quite frankly, that's not enough time. But you all know what I mean. It's possible to have that site cached. The first type of attack that we're going to look at is going to take advantage of that DNS cache. It's going to take advantage of the time-saving feature of saving an IP address or saving a DNS record locally or closer to you so that you don't have to call out to the root servers all the time. I've actually seen some attackers take advantage of this attack. Some of them do it at more of a local host-based level, but you'll see this happen inside of organizations, at the organization's DNS as well. A DNS cache poisoning is a really actually simple type of attack. And I like to equate it to a cell phone for folks who are not familiar with these attacks. Let's say you hand me your phone and your phone's unlocked, first mistake, and I get a peek at your address book. I open up the address book entry for mom or for sister or for my significant other, whatever it may be, and I change that number to be something malicious. I change it to be someone who's going to sound like your mom and then ask you for a credit card number, right? Or do something that normally wouldn't happen. But what's happening is I'm taking advantage of that trust. I'm taking advantage of you opening your phone, pressing the mom button, and calling and expecting to reach someone who you know is associated with that address. DNS cache poisoning does the exact same approach. It takes that DNS cache and it says, you know what? Instead of sending Matt to google.com, the actual legitimate google.com, I'm going to put in my own IP address. And I'm going to make a malicious page where I've actually got a clone of google.com running. But the first thing that happens when you log into my google.com is it says you've been logged out of your Gmail. Please enter your credentials one more time. So by that, I've poisoned the DNS cache, and that's obviously where we get the name from. I've poisoned the cache. I'm changing the IP addresses that are returned to your organization upon the lookup. If your users are unaware of this change, unfortunately, you may find yourself losing credentials pretty quickly. Even worse, if your users are kind of the blind leading the blind and they're following down that path of habitual computer behavior, which is, I know when I go to Google or mail.google.com or facebook.com, I'm going to get prompted for a login. I'm going to have my password manager auto fill that for me, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click enter, right? If I'm going to a particular site that requires a login, the last thing I want to do is sit there and stare and analyze the login page. So a lot of our attackers take advantage of this behavior, and they know that your users are usually part of the yes crowd. They accept terms and conditions. They click through yes. They just want to enter their password and get to the data. So with DNS cache poisoning, I can control what it is they're looking at, and then the rest just falls into place. Now, there are some efforts out there to actually make DNS cache poisoning a lot more difficult, and we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about DNSSEC, but you need to know, and I'm at this last bullet point here, the one in bold, you need to know that DNSSEC actually is an awesome advantage for DNS traffic. Essentially, what DNSSEC does is it actually allows us to wrap cryptographic signatures to DNS records. It actually allows me to take a website, to look up a website, and attach a signature and say, this is 100% true, the legitimate IP address that belongs to that site. And then when my users go to access that site, that cryptographic hash or that cryptographic signature is verified. So therefore, your users know, or your software knows, I'm actually accessing what it is I'm looking for. The beautiful thing about DNSSEC, obviously, as I'm sure you can guess, is that it's another layer that the attackers have to jump through in order to successfully execute one of these attacks. DNSSEC, if you're a site admin, or if you're running if you're running a website, or if you're familiar with domain management, you know that DNSSEC is these days very, very trivial to implement. Now, we're going to talk about the disadvantage of DNSSEC in a minute, but I would highly recommend going the route of cryptographically securing your DNS records, because it all but removes this type of attack from the landscape. It makes it a lot easier to mitigate this when you are trusting what you're going for. And it's funny too, to go back to my earlier point, where a lot of organizations are now focusing on HTTPS. They're now focusing on encrypted traffic. They're focusing on certificate authorities. They're making sure that their users are going to legitimate sites with verified encryption certificates. But yet, again, even though we've got all this focus on encryption over on port 443, I've got a lot of folks not doing the same for 53. It's a really easy implementation. So that's the first thing I would take. But again, we'll get to one of the negative impacts of DNSSEC in just a moment here. One of the other types of attacks that we may see is, of course, everyone's favorite DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service. Now, we can't talk about DNS without bringing DDoS onto the scene. Now, let me pause for just a moment here. We're talking about ways to make DNS more integrated into your security posture. I am not going to give you the recipe to successfully protect yourself and never get DDoSed. We all know that these attacks can get into the hundreds of gigabits, if dozens, if not hundreds of gigabits per second. There's only so much I can put in place. We're going to talk about some of those mitigations in just a moment. If you're familiar with companies and folks that do DDoS mitigation, you know exactly what I'm referring to. There are some safeguards we can put into place, but at the end of the day, you know, a big enough cannon will knock down any door. It's best instead that we understand these type of attacks, we understand what's happening, and then instead of just saying I can never protect against a DDoS, what I can do instead is I can understand the various ways that a DDoS can be used against me, and then I can protect against those. We've got 3 different types of attacks we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about flood, reflection, and amplification. Again, this is just to get everyone on the same level so that we all know what we're talking about when it gets to DNS threats. DNS flood attacks. A flood attack is very, very, very straightforward. And what I'm doing here is I am taking a botnet, or I'm taking thousands, if not millions, if not dozens or hundreds of millions, and I am doing my best to flood a server with DNS requests. I'm going to send so much data down the wire that it's going to gridlock your operations. If anyone on the line that lives inside of Los Angeles or lives inside of, I take on LA because I know the traffic's bad. I live in Dallas myself, and the traffic here is horrible. If you live in a main city, you know exactly what happens when too much traffic tries to go to one central point. It clogs up, and what should be a 5-minute drive becomes an hour standstill. DNS floods seek to do the exact same thing. They just seek to do it on the internet. Now, as we get more advanced, there's one consideration here, which is the more advanced the internet gets and the more capable we get of handling bandwidth, the more systems you need in order to actually make one of these attacks successful. But what if I told you you could go and for maybe a few bucks, grab yourself access to a botnet for an evening and go ahead and launch one of these attacks? In fact, you don't even need to launch the attack yourself. You can just pay someone to do it. You can get DDoS attacks for hire. There are botnets and connected systems out there, millions and millions and millions of computers just waiting for commands to be abused, just waiting to join the crowd and impact some harm on some of these organizations. So again, flood attacks are taking a lot of systems and flooding a server with DNS. It typically must happen via bots or automated scripts. From a mitigation point of view, how can I avoid a flood attack? Well, if someone's going to launch targets at you, it's going to be tough to mitigate because a lot of traffic is going to be coming your way. What you want to think about doing instead, which we're going to talk about in a few slides, is you want to think about, maybe I need to start putting DNS at my perimeter. Maybe I need to start having DNS as part of the decision making at my firewall. We'll get to that in just a moment. But you can see how these DNS attacks really bring DNS to the forefront, because how do I defend against this sheer amount of data coming through? Another type of DNS attack we're going to see as well is reflection attacks. Reflection attack is really straightforward. I drop a letter in the mail. This is actually, I don't want to say it's a common technique, but it's a dirty postal technique. I drop a letter in the mail, and me, Matt, wants to send the letter to Bob, who works elsewhere. But instead of putting from me to Bob, I'm going to put to me from Bob. And I'm not going to put a stamp on there. As far as the Postal Service is concerned, that letter looks like it came from Bob. So if they want to return that letter, they're going to return it to Bob, even though it's actually me who put it in there. Reflection attacks work very much the same way. I'm going to send a DNS request out to a server, but I don't want you to send the response back to me. I want you to send the response back to my target system, the company that I'm trying to cause some damage with over there. And I'm going to do this hundreds and hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions of times. I'm going to take advantage of every open DNS server I can find, and I'm going to ask all of those servers to simultaneously send DNS responses to one particular system. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, why don't I just disallow all the traffic to come through? Well, how do I tell my organization to ignore DNS, to not allow it? Very, very tough to do. So this traffic is going to come in and it's going to be considered by your organization. Unfortunately, it's going to be coming through in waves. Now, if that doesn't sound scary enough, I'm actually going to amplify a reflective attack, and I'm going to now add a bunch of unnecessary data into the DNS packet. So before, where you were trying to go through millions and millions of maybe a few dozen bytes at a time, maybe a couple dozen bytes of DNS responses, now you're going through 50 to 60 times more data. Guess what? Slows your devices down, makes it a lot harder for your network devices to keep up. We're amplifying the attack because we're just adding specially crafted packets. And those packets are going to contain, again, such an enormous amount of data that your system just gets overloaded trying to process it all. So let's step away from DDoS. Let's talk about some novel abuses of DNS. The first one we're at is DNS tunneling. DNS tunneling is actually a really, really slick technique. A lot of folks are used to tunneling taking place over port. That's right, 22. Everyone's familiar with SSH and the particular ports associated with that. However, some really, really crafty folks have put together a way to do SSH over DNS. If you're looking at this from your organization point of view, what's the problem here? Well, the problem is your SIM is alerting on port 22. Your SIM is alerting on port 443, and your SIM is alerting on port 80. You're not alerting on 53 because there's way too much data going through there. Part of the data going through there is your attackers pushing through their remote sessions. Again, it's a normal operation. DNS tunneling is not going to stop your business from receiving its typical DNS request. Instead, the attackers are going to utilize those extra data portions of those packets and wrap their own SSH commands inside of it. I have investigated attack groups that will run through the gauntlet when they infect the system or when they infect an environment. And they will first check 443, up, being monitored. They'll first check 80, up, closed off. Then they'll check 22, okay, being monitored. And they'll check 53. It's usually within the top 4 ports that they check because the ability to tunnel over DNS is as trivial as running a script. It's been made that simple. Not only can we obviously tunnel over DNS, where again, I'm setting up that bi-communicative pattern there, that bilateral communication where I'm talking and someone's talking back. I'm maintaining a persistence mechanism there. I can also use DNS as data exfiltration. Now, obviously, tunneling via DNS means I've got to go out and I've got to come back. Data exfiltration adds, I think, a little bit more danger to the scene because now it's just data out. It's just data going out the door. Again, no monitoring, no flagging, no introspection whatsoever. It's just data flying out the door. If I've got port 53 open, what I'm doing in this case is I'm essentially giving my attackers an open door to get data out of my environment. Very similar to SSH tunneling. It is usually left open and it is usually not caught. Very, very dangerous approach. Now, I wanted to, again, back to DNS exfiltration, that's your data walking out the door. This came out just a couple weeks ago. I was reading about this and I had to make sure we got it inside of this presentation. There's also a research out there who's actually built a file system on top of DNS as well. What they're doing in this particular case is they're taking advantage of the DNS cache, and they're storing extra data inside of the DNS packets. And then they're utilizing the time to live or the cache retention periods on various DNS servers. So what's happening here is someone may find that there's a DNS server that caches data for a week. So they'll push up a few specially crafted packets, and there's some extra data in those packets that has some file system, has some files inside of it. Maybe it's a picture, maybe it's a piece of malware, maybe it's an executable. But they've essentially distributed their files in this case, and they're being stored. Now, yes, a week is not a long time to live, but most attackers just need a few minutes in order to get those files into your environment and to get them executed. So really, really cool tool. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about this one, obviously, but I'd highly encourage folks. The slide deck is available after the presentation. I would highly recommend you check out DNSFS, created by Ben Cox. It's really, really neat the way that he's put together the ability to basically abuse DNS resolver caches to store persistent data. Again, short-lived, but just another example as to how your attackers will likely abuse DNS is they can also then use it as a file store. They can pull down those various executables that they need to over DNS. And if they find 53 not being monitored, there we go. Now let's talk about a quick situation of abuse in the wild. If you're in the retail hospitality industry, again, this is going to apply a little bit to you. Make sure your ears are perked up here. I want to talk about the FrameworkPOS variant. Whenever we talk about a POS variant piece of malware, we're talking about card scraping. We're talking about malware that is going in, looking for that payment card data, looking for the swipes that you all go through when we go and purchase things. I'm a normal consumer myself. I swipe my card every day. And, well, these days I insert my card. Hopefully we're not swiping anymore. But regardless, we've got malware out there that's going to look for those particular numbers. FrameworkPOS actually presents a really novel challenge because the tool or the authors of FrameworkPOS found a way to actually exfiltrate their data over DNS. There's a reason why in the incident response world, immediate exfiltration is very dangerous. And I'll explain a little bit why. A lot of normal POS malware will scrape data. It will store it in a local file or a file somewhere in the environment. And then an attacker's got to swoop back in order to get that file later on. So I can have card scraping malware pulling numbers from memory all day long. But if my attackers can't get back in to get to those numbers, what's my risk profile at that point? I'm basically collecting data that I shouldn't be, but no one can get access to it. I can kill that one very quickly. But if I've got a piece of malware that is flying out the door and it's sending DNS data very, very quickly with those card numbers inside of it, then now I'm watching data leave. And the way that this piece of malware works is it scrapes data, it takes the track, it splits it into two parts, does a custom encoding, and then it recombines them into that DNS packet that gets sent out. And sure enough, that DNS packet gets sent directly to an attacker-owned server. They're not sending it out to the Google DNS servers of the world in order for them to hang on to it and parse it for them. They're sending it right back to their C2 system. So again, immediate scraping, immediate data exfiltration gets very, very dangerous, very hairy. Now let's talk about turning liability into an asset. First off, you need to be able to capture DNS. This is the one thing I'm going to tell most folks inside of any organization that I get to work in is you are already generating DNS traffic. You just need to reach out and grab it. If you are not grabbing it, then look at your network capture tools. If you're already capturing net flow, you're likely already getting some introspection of DNS. If you're already got full packet capture, you're getting DNS, hopefully. You're just not parsing it out. Make sure you talk with your network team. You drop those filters and those capture points at those critical points in your network. Remember, we're talking about a structure that involves a lot of systems that are not yours. So we've got to make sure we go after the pivotal points. We usually want to focus on when my users request a website, where does that traffic flow through? And there's likely some sort of an internal DNS server that your organization manages. That's where you want to start your first capture point. You may also want to go to the perimeter as well. You may also want to go to the perimeter to capture what's coming in. Can I line up my requests and responses in order to have them make sense? Now, what are some of the things that I can look for in my DNS traffic in order to turn this into something that I can use? The first thing I tell a lot of folks to look for is look for that anomalous traffic. When I say anomalous, I mean out of the ordinary. You know when your business is the most busy. You know when the users are doing the most lookups, when the users are doing the most activity. Look for things that fall outside of that pattern. Why is the HR department making significant DNS requests at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday? Right? Look for those things that just don't make sense. That's on the outbound. On the inbound, again, look for large data packets coming through. Look for someone trying to push something into your environment that shouldn't be there. DNS typically should not be too large. Look for those DNS responses without requests. Utilize your perimeter technology to line those two things up. Every request should have a response and vice versa. If I start to get a lot of DNS responses without any requests, that means there's likely something coming down the line. Again, we're talking about volume here. And the most important two between all of these is your off-peak traffic. How else can I use DNS in my organization as an advantage? Well, one of the other approaches we can take is I can also combine with additional log sources. Remember, I'm looking at an enterprise as a whole. If I see a DNS request go out and I think it's potentially tied to a bad machine, I need to be able to know where that machine is. I'm going to go to my IP address management and my DHCP logs, and I'm going to combine these sources together. With these two things combined, the ability to track users throughout your environment becomes almost instantaneous. I can also use DNS to scope incidents and compromises as well. So usually when you think of an incident or a compromise, we think of one compromised host reaching out to a malicious domain, to a malicious IP. Maybe we're going to see some DNS traffic in there. I can take that analysis. I can take that data point and I can pivot that against the rest of my environment as well. And instead of going host by host, instead of looking at my AV logs, or instead of trying to understand one way to try and find all of the compromised hosts in my environment, why don't I just go to the DNS logs? And I want to look for everyone who's tried to call the bad guy in the past 24 hours. If your organization has suffered a ransomware incident, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Ransomware hits a network, it travels fast, and it spreads. And all those systems have to generate that random cryptographic key. They all reach out to a malicious server somewhere. So use this as a great incident response tool to find that compromise in your environment. Use it as a pivot point. That's where we get to the importance of retaining this data. And the very last bit you're going to hear from me today is kind of looking at what's next for DNS. We've talked about some attacks. We've talked about some ways to make DNS more integral to your environment and more integral to your security team. If your security team does not get on the bandwagon and get DNS included as part of your posture or as part of their tools, your attackers will find new ways to abuse it. As of 3 weeks ago, we didn't have public code to use DNS as a file system. Now we do. There's a lot of development coming out about it. Second, if you're not logging DNS traffic, please start. You're already generating it. Make sure you are capturing this. Integrate DNS with additional logs. It's going to give your SOC the ability to pivot faster. It's going to give your incident response team the ability to find compromise much quicker. And then lastly, take advantage of the security tools that are out there, the security products and implementations. DNSSEC is going to continue making our life easier. It's going to help us mitigate against really simple attacks, and it's going to allow us to have a much more secure environment. And with that, everyone, I'm going to pause and hand it over to Krupa. Krupa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Matt, and I hope you feel better soon. Those were some really great insights into kind of really specific ways that DNS could be used, by attackers, right? Matt talked about different types of attacks that could actually bring down the infrastructure. He talked about ransomware and other malware threats that actually use DNS as a conduit, and data can also leave the building through DNS, and those are some great examples that Matt gave us. What I am going to be kind of double clicking on is this notion of using DNS to protect your sensitive data, and also using DNS to identify and detect malware early, right, before it causes damage. So one of the things that typical malware and even advanced malware like ransomware does is once it's breached the perimeter, one of the first things it does is to connect to its command and control site, or communicate to its command and control site using DNS. So DNS can become that first vantage point, which can actually tell you something suspicious is going on. And that's exactly kind of what we're going to talk about, is how can you use DNS to detect that malicious activity. I know, most of you may be familiar with, or some of you may be familiar with this notion of a cyber kill chain. And this is a framework that's often used to describe how a malware typically goes through different phases before it actually, achieves its end goal, which is most likely, data exfiltration. So typically, malware does what's called reconnaissance to check out how your network is configured, where are the vulnerabilities, and then there's a weaponization phase where it'll decide which vulnerability to exploit to deliver the payload, and then it actually delivers the payload and then starts to spread within the victim's network. It communicates, as I mentioned, to its command and control site, and then finally it either exfiltrates data or does some sort of similar activity. So you would be surprised to know that DNS actually is part of a lot of these stages in the kill chain, meaning that DNS can be used for reconnaissance activity. It can tell you where, how these servers are configured, if there's any loopholes, maybe the DNS server is running old software. It provides a lot of information and around the vulnerabilities in a network. You could also infiltrate malicious code through DNS infiltration or DNS tunneling. You could also hijack, as Matt mentioned earlier. You could do DNS hijacking or other sorts of exploits using the DNS protocol. And then communications to bad sites, the CNC callbacks, also happens through DNS. And then you can also exfiltrate data through DNS. So the point here I'm trying to make is that in the cyber kill chain, DNS can be used in all of these stages, or most of these stages. So the best way to identify when something suspicious or when malicious activity is going on is to monitor those DNS activities and DNS logs, as Matt talked about, and not just monitor, but use certain techniques to block that malicious activity, and I'll cover that a little bit later. Just some statistics on how often DNS is being used in such a manner. There was a recent survey that was done around around DNS attacks, putting organizations at risk, and in that survey, 46% and 45% respectively said that they experienced DNS-based data exfiltration and DNS-based tunneling. So what this means is, traditional methods of sending data out or leaking data out, there are tools for that, to detect that. There are DLP solutions. There's endpoint security that can help you detect kind of the traditional methods for data theft. Whereas if you look at DNS, nobody's watching DNS. Nobody's checking if the DNS queries actually are embedding data in them. So attackers know that, and they're increasingly using that as a conduit. In terms of malware, 91% of malware, once it's inside the network, uses DNS to carry out its campaigns. We have security reports that indicate that. And the challenge with just using antivirus or regular traditional tools is malware keeps changing. It keeps morphing, and just in 2015 there was like 431 million new unique pieces of malware, and and all the CNC communications happen through DNS. So again, DNS becomes this conduit for exploitation, and there are very little tools that actually monitor or do anything. The traditional security tools don't have visibility into the DNS traffic, or they're not built for that. They are built to detect HTTP activity, email phishing, things like that, but nobody's really looking at what's going on at the DNS level. And one of the questions we often get is, okay, but what about next-gen firewalls? I have next-gen firewalls, that can detect malicious activity and communications. So why do I need another layer of security, or why do I need a DNS layer security? And the challenge with next-gen firewalls is it's great for what it's built for, which is perimeter protection. But again, all firewalls, or most of the time firewalls, leave port 53 open, which is a port that's used for DNS. And they do little in terms of inspecting any traffic that's going through port 53. And the reason is it's not their job. And if you turn on inspection on port 53 and you turn on all of these capabilities, the performance on the next-gen firewalls is going to go down. So intentionally, they don't do that. And the other challenge with firewalls is, maybe they can detect some malicious activity going to, a CNC site, but they cannot detect more advanced threats and data exfiltration that could be happening via DNS, because again, they're not built to analyze and monitor in real time all the DNS queries that are going out. It's not its job, right? And the other part is next-gen firewalls are typically, in the perimeter, they're far away from the actual end devices or endpoints, whereas a DNS server is actually very close to the endpoints, and it sees the queries first, it sees the activities first, whereas a next-gen firewall, being further away from the endpoints, it might not even know which device the infected or the malicious communications are coming from, because it's usually forwarded to it through a server or something. There's a server in between or something like that. So while next-gen firewalls are great, we always recommend complementing next-gen firewall deployment or solution with a DNS layer security to give that defense in depth. So, just like companies have email security or web security, it makes a lot of sense to have DNS-based security. So let's say you are thinking about implementing a DNS-based security solution. Some of the things you should look for are, does it use the DNS control plane to block malware and APT activity, right? So one of the ways to do that is to use what's called RPZ functionality, or response policy zone functionality. What that does is it uses a blacklist, so like a reputation feed, and then you can block any suspicious activity to any destination on that list at the DNS level. So you can block DNS queries from going to those bad destinations. And what this does is it prevents malware from executing further and spreading, right? And then you should also look for solutions that can help you protect not just within the corporate network, but also, increasingly you may have employees are working from multiple locations. They're working from home. They're working from Starbucks or from client locations. So having that security that can follow them wherever they go, I think that's important. And one of the ways to do that is to look at a SaaS-based solution that can provide DNS-based security from the cloud, so that wherever the device is, wherever the user is, his device is still protected. I would say the other thing you should look for in a DNS security solution would be something that provides you data protection. So something that looks for data exfiltration happening via DNS and can block that. And I will go a little bit deeper into ways that you can do that in a little bit. And then you also want deep visibility, right? Just getting to that endpoint level information around the infected endpoints and getting more information around those infected endpoints is important. So you need to know if that infected endpoint is, a production system that's running critical applications. Then you have to take care of that first. So for prioritization, that visibility is important as well. So the best way to detect these advanced threats, including ransomware, including domain generation algorithms, or DGAs as they're called, or fast flux, data exfiltration, all of these things, many of these things, like other than ransomware, the other three I mentioned are pretty kind of zero-day threats, so to speak, in the sense that they don't have standard signatures. They don't have, they may not be going to a domain that has a bad reputation. But you need to have a solution that can look for certain anomalous patterns. We always recommend a multi-pronged approach. So making sure you use a combination of reputation which is the bad neighborhoods in the internet and those blacklists that I mentioned earlier, but also signatures. For example, DNS tunneling, certain DNS tunneling toolkits like Iodine have known signatures. So just checking for those signatures and blocking malicious activity using signatures is the second approach. And the third one, which is the most, I would say, advanced and critical method to detect those zero-day threats is what we call behavioral analytics. And behavioral analytics, what it does is it looks at DNS queries in real time, and it looks for certain patterns to see if there's data embedded in the DNS queries. Does it look like information? How often is what's the frequency? Where is it going to? And there are certain parameters that a typical behavioral analytics module will look for to see if there's data embedded in the queries. And what this does is it helps detect those advanced threats like DGAs, fast blocks, and data exfil, and then you can block those threats as well at the DNS level. So multi-pronged approach is very important. And also threat intelligence. So you want to make sure that you're using curated, up-to-date, and aggregated threat intelligence when you're blocking these communications to bad sites. So there are some organizations that use single threat feeds from a single source, or maybe they're using open source threat feeds. But we always recommend using a platform that aggregates threat intelligence from multiple sources, because no single source is going to give you that comprehensive view of all the bad neighborhoods out there on the internet, or new infrastructure that's popping up or being set up by attackers to launch attacks. So when you aggregate threat intel from different sources, you get kind of the best knowledge from all those different sources into one platform. And then you can use that same threat intel across the board, not just in your DNS infrastructure, but also you can use that threat intelligence in, for example, your Palo Alto Networks firewalls, or your IDS devices, or your SIM solutions. So always consolidating and optimizing your use of threat intelligence is something we recommend. I'll skip this one. So when you look at data exfiltration over DNS queries, one of the ways it happens is that, let's say, an infected endpoint gets access to a sensitive file. Let's say it's patient information, right? So what we've seen happen is it'll encrypt that information, break it up into chunks, and then send it via DNS queries to a destination, right? And at the other side, the attacker server is now receiving all these DNS requests. It reconstructs the data, logs it, and decrypts it, and it now has information around that patient information. So again, it's these advanced techniques are created to evade detection by standard tools like next-gen firewalls or other tools, or even DLP solutions. Like DLP solutions are built to look at HTTP traffic and other protocols, but they don't have visibility into DNS queries, and they don't know what a good DNS query is and what a malicious DNS query looks like, right? So you need a DNS-based solution to detect these type of threats. And so one of the ways we do that is, as I mentioned, behavioral analytics. You can look at TXT records or the records in the DNS queries, and you can actually check for presence of data using using lexical and temporal analysis, right? And once you're fairly certain that there is data being embedded in the queries, you can start blocking those DNS queries to those destinations. So this is something that's unique, and that's something that's needed to detect those advanced threats. The other thing I would, we highly recommend from a DNS security solution that you want to implement is making sure that you share all this information with the other ecosystem tools that you're already using. Many organizations have SIM solutions, they have vulnerability scanners, they may have network NAC solutions. So DDI, or DNS, DHCP, and IPAM has a lot of information that can be useful for these security tools. For example, DHCP fingerprinting can provide information around what type of device it is. where it is in the network. IPAM, or IP address management, can give you more information around where it is in the network. There's a lot of information around lease history that you can get. And then with integration with Microsoft AD, you know exactly who it's assigned to. So there's a wealth of information in DNS, DHCP, and IPAM, and that information can be leveraged along with the hits that you detect with the DNS security solution. You can send that information to these tools so that they can take further action. For example, if I know that a particular device is making a bad communication using DNS, if I send information about that device to a vulnerability scanner, the vulnerability scanner can go and scan it and check for additional vulnerabilities. If I send that information to an endpoint security, say Carbon Black, then Carbon Black can go and clean up the device. So when we detect something malicious, we can send that information out, and that really helps with remediation. So just some examples of some of the integrations that make sense, like really good use cases. It's like SIM solutions. So when you provide visibility around IP address changes or any DNS security events, that SIM solution can be used, can get that data, and then SOC teams of security analysts can do further analysis. I talked about the vulnerability scanner use case. And then I talked about the SaaS-based model. So one of the things you should look for is a solution that gives you flexibility, right? So some organizations may want on-premises based protection. So you want to have appliances on-prem with DNS security on top of it. Or if you're a cloud-first company, or if you have the need to protect remote offices, branch offices, or you're just tired of installing more and more stuff on-premise, then you can opt for a SaaS-based DNS security solution as well. And a truly hybrid security model is actually pretty good, because if you have a hybrid security model that has an on-premises and a SaaS-based component, then you can now manage everything using a single dashboard, and you get full visibility as well into all the devices. So I think I'll just wrap it up with next steps. I know we have maybe 3-4 minutes for Q&A. But in terms of next steps, we do have some free product evals you can try out on our website, ActiveTrust Cloud and ActiveTrust. And of course, if you have more questions around DNS security or would like to discuss your architectures with us, we always welcome those discussions and conversations. All right, I think with that, we can move to Q&A.
All right, well, thank you both for your great presentation. As Krupa noted, we have a couple of minutes for Q&A. If we don't get to your question, please submit it to q@sans.org and we can get that tended to. Our first question is, will password managers that autofill recognize that the poison page is not the correct or expected page? I think this came in during Matt's portion.
Yeah, I'll field that one. Interesting question about whether managers would be able to recognize. So it depends on how the password manager is set up. In most cases, they are set up to recognize URLs and will likely not populate immediately. That's where the next step or the next level of security comes in. So if your password manager does not auto-populate, does that lead to the user examining the URL, or does it lead to the user saying, this stupid thing doesn't work again? So then they go and copy the password anyways and just insert it. But very good point, which is depending on the password manager, it may not auto-populate due to the domain, which may be, due to the web address, which may be spoofed. So good point.
All right, we'll switch over to one for Krupa so we don't strain your voice any further, Matt. Thank you for that. We have recently discovered 2 well-known security vendors within our environment that were using DNS tunneling for their products to transfer data rather than use a straightforward approach like a known port to open. For one vendor, we had to actually disable a product feature to stop the tunneling. Our risk analytics network scanner alerted us to this DNS tunneling behavior. How can we stop vendors from adapting this practice?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. There are many vendors who use DNS tunneling to send information back and forth between the endpoint. Let's say there's an app, usually it's like apps that are running on endpoints, and they want to send information back and forth to their server. They use DNS tunneling, and you're right that it's probably not a best practice to do that, but a lot of applications use that, and it's not for malicious purposes. It's just to send information back and forth because they know that DNS is open. So while you can't necessarily prevent the actual vendors from using DNS tunneling for their own purposes, what you can do with a solution that can detect DNS tunneling, what you can do is you can allow certain tunneling to happen if you know that it's a legitimate case, right? I think even Spotify uses DNS tunneling, is what I've heard, to send information back and forth. So with a good DNS security solution, you can allow certain DNS tunneling, or you can block certain DNS tunneling. So you can provide that flexibility, but you definitely want to block the malicious stuff. So there is a way to whitelist certain DNS tunneling attempts, but there's nothing you can really do to block like an application vendor from using DNS.
All right, well, with that, we are out of time. Thank you so much, Matt and Krupa, for your great presentation, and to Infoblox for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.